one of the reasons why I wanted to deal with these 10 rules is I think that it's really, really helpful considering like the escalation that we've watched in the last few years, where you can like call things into the consciousness of other people by defining them, by putting labels to them. It's much easier to understand what something is when it's labeled. So whenever I see an effort of a person to look at a phenomenon and kind of diagram it and put terms to it, like Taibbi did here, I think that's a really, really useful thing in understanding how the media we consume, if we're watching some of this stuff ironically or critically, or even alternative media that in many cases is using a lot of the same plays in their presentation, these 10 rules of hate. We're more conscious of how it affects us by understanding these 10 rules, but we're also more conscious of how it affects others and how we can outreach to others using very, very clear definitions and explanations of what's actually happening here. So I think he does a great service. The year is 2022, and why do we all hate each other so much? I'm Brett Venat.
And I'm Nathan Frazier.
And this is Mindset and Mastery.
All right, Brett Venat, you brought an interesting topic to the podcast today, and we're going to talk about 10 rules of hate.
Well, we're here just focusing on one specific part of this book that Matt Taibbi wrote called Hate Incorporated, Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. I think, what you need to know about Matt Taibbi, he's been active throughout most of the 21st century. He's covered a lot of financial stories, a lot of political and corporate corruption stories. He is certainly, I would say, if you had to put him in a camp, he'd be, well, I guess that means something different now. But if you had to put him on a side, he'd be traditionally more aligned with the left. But in 2019, he wrote a book that I think perfectly explains how just about every news story has been treated by the corporate press in the 21st century and by lots of alternative media outlets as well. There's lots of people who are following this, 10 rules of hate formula that he lays out. Now, of course, he's a bit of a polemicist, so he takes some liberties. I want everybody to read this book, but you have to tolerate a bit of Taibbi's personality. So when we were doing show prep a couple weeks ago, I said, will you read this book? And if you don't have time, can we just do this one part of it? Because I think that so many people who are consuming media still, even though we've warned them about it, would really, really benefit from going behind the scenes and seeing all of this from Taibbi's perspective as somebody who has worked, covering being on the plane with politicians during presidential campaigns. He's definitely an insider, but he's like an outsider's insider. And now he's, I think, doing a really great service in this book, even though this book is almost 3 years old, of reporting to us investigatively what he found over the last 2 decades working in the mainstream, in and around the mainstream media. So Hate Incorporated, Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another, gets my highest recommendation. This is one of the most important and memorable parts of the book that we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, and I want to just add my 2 cents as a marketer. There's something that we do called villains and virtues, and it's a way to align with your target market to say, hey, we share the same virtues, we share the same villains, and it's a polarization technique to get people to trust you, to get people to blindly go along with you, and it works great in marketing. And it seems like 20 years ago or so, the media, I kind of have this theory that once media was no longer 5 channels that had to appeal to everybody, they started being flooded with 24-hour news of 60 different channels on cable networks. And so they had to say, okay, we can't do the one-size-fits-all media anymore. We need to start figuring out how to better market media. We need to figure out who our audience is and start confirming what they want to believe, start avoiding stories that are going to cause cognitive dissonance. We need to really niche down or niche down on how we deliver media. And one of the core things that they decided to implement is what I call the villains and virtues aspect of marketing. Fox News, I think, was the first one to do it, and Matt Taibbi, in this article, he talks a lot about Fox News because they were the first ones to kind of implement this and master it. But since then, MSNBC, CNN, they've all adopted the same style of branding and marketing over actual non-biased information delivery. And it's led to, I think, the situation we have right now where everything is so divisive, everything is so polarized. And it goes back to at about the time of 9/11 when news media was just exploding. You had to differentiate yourself. You had to pick a target market, and marketing became more important, and the polarization of marketing became more important than delivering non-biased information. And so he brings this up. In this particular article, he does a lot of finger pointing at Fox News, which I think is well deserved. I also think he does a fair job of pointing out that Fox News took the model and really ran with it, but they kind of handed the baton off to all the other news media networks, and that's kind of why we're in the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah, I think starting in 2001, Fox became the most popular cable news network, and they held that position for 15 years. Until when? Until somebody else grabbed their playbook and used it in all of the build up to the 2016 election and their villain and virtue of, are you for Donald Trump or are you against Donald Trump? So it might have been CNN, it might have been MSNBC who temporarily took over, but they couldn't hold that spot because they were simply too intolerable. They are still using this model as basically the only thing that's keeping them in business. Fox's embrace of this grew out of talk radio. So this has its genesis in the 1990s. I really don't think the villains and virtues thing inside like one country becomes palpable until the rise of Barack Obama in 2008. That's where it really, really goes off the rail with people picking sides politically. But there was a different version of villains and virtues in the 20th century, really since the advent of television. But we as Americans were the virtuous against some other kind of villain. And that was, this has always been a profit-driven enterprise ever since they realized that they could sell ads in between the news. So once that was understood, the villains and virtues model was used, but the villain was the Soviets and then the terrorists. And really after 9/11 and the war and Saddam and all that, we start to see this transition in the first decade of the 21st century to this becoming an internal conflict. And it's just gotten worse and worse year after year. But what is understood is, I think, seeing the success of things like reality television, professional wrestling, even sports broadcasting in general, like being able to draw clear lines between good and evil and reassuring your viewers that they are on the side of good and get them to check back at, how evil is trying to screw them today has just been an incredibly successful model. And it goes back to our very first episode. The first episode we did of our series, Emotional Manipulators for Hire, was on 28 words to make the world do your bidding. And it was something like, I'm going to paraphrase the 28 words, but people will do anything for somebody who can point out who their enemies are, teach them to throw rocks, to show them how to throw rocks at that enemy, and reassure them that they are right and just and virtuous in the process. Like, that is marketing gold. And the media is doing this kind of twisted form of entertainment and presenting it as like the viewer actually acquiring information, which is closer to the opposite of what's actually happening. People are just getting more and more siloed and deeply confused by what's going on in the world through the echo chambers that they choose to keep going back to for whatever, cognitive bias or cognitive, confirmation bias or comfort that they get from it. So here we are in this mess, and I think Matt Taibbi does a great job of explaining it throughout the entire book. But this is the money chapter right here. I think it's chapter 10, and it is called The 10 Rules of Hate. And so we're going to go through those 10 rules.
And let's just kind of play back and forth. I'd like to get your thoughts. I have a couple of thoughts, and we'll just go point by point through each of these rules.
Absolutely. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to read his introduction really quickly to the chapter itself. So that kind of puts us in, from his point of view as to why this is important beyond what we've already explained. He writes, pick up any major newspaper or turn on any television network news broadcast. The political orientation won't matter. It could be Fox or MSNBC, the Washington Post, the Washington Times. You'll find virtually every story checks certain boxes. Call them the 10 rules of hate. After generations of doing the opposite, when unity and conformity were more profitable, the primary product the news media now sells is division. The problem we, in the media, all have is the commercial structure of the business. To make money, we've had to train audiences to consume news in a certain way. We need you anxious, pre-pissed, addicted to conflict. Moreover, we need you to bring a series of assumptions every time you open a paper or turn to your phone, TV, or car radio. Without them, most of what we produce will seem illogical and offensive. So we're going to jump into the first one, and he writes it. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to play a little bit of defense. I've worked in media for 20 years now. I have to also blame the audience. The audience, in my experience, good news stories just don't grab the attention. The audience doesn't want good news stories. The audience, he talks about, we need the audience to be primed for this. We need the audience to be conditioned for this. It's been my experience, the audience dictates to the media what they want. And a lot of times the media is just giving the audience what they've said, this is what we demand. So there's a little bit of blame to go around.
No, and I would say all the blame, one of the reasons why we do a show like this is we're not talking to Don Lemon. We're not talking to Sean Hannity. Our best hope, and even this is a little far-fetched, is we are talking to the people who are consuming them. Or what we're really doing is talking to the people who are talking to the people who consume that, and hopefully giving them some gentle ammunition. I don't think anyone's ever said that phrase before. Gentle ammunition to maybe bring to those discussions about why their media consumption habits are dangerous. In that introduction, just to your point, Taibbi continues, he says, so long as the public is busy hating each other and not aiming its ire at more complex financial and political processes going on off camera, there's very little danger of anything like a popular uprising. So all the blame has to go on the consumer or the person creating the demand. These people are going to keep doing this. They're going to keep creating this kind of media as long as people keep consuming it. Now, you can say that you've seen drop-offs in certain television networks or readership at the New York Times or whatever, but they're staying in business right now with this model. And while some conflict and some discord is certainly good in any kind of a political environment, what we're watching right now is not that. It is not healthy for the people participating in it or for the people who are going to have to live in it. So yes, I second that. Let's target this at the consumers because they're the only people whose behavior is probably going to change. Everybody else is just too in love with the smell of their own farts. There's no way that you could do outreach to, a Cuomo or a Lemon or an Anderson Cooper or a Rachel Maddow. They would never. And these people have had mirrors put all around them for 20 years. Look at the costly mistakes that you have made. And they won't do it. They won't look in those mirrors. What we're seeing right now with the situation in Eastern Europe and Russia, and you compare that to the blind cheerleading for war 20 years ago in Iraq, it's like the same people have learned absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. And the book does a really, really good job of giving, really, really specific examples of their absolute refusal to learn anything from their blindness or their mistakes.
Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump into it. We've got 10 points to go through, and clock's ticking.
Absolutely. Number one, there are only two ideas. He writes, there are only two baskets of allowable opinion: Republican, Democrat, liberal and conservative, left or right. By the time we hit college, most of us, roughly speaking, will have chosen the political identity we'll stick with for the rest of our lives. I don't know. That seems like it might be changing a little bit, that latter part. But yeah, like, there is no presentation beyond that, like, these are the two appropriate ways to feel. This is what exists inside the Overton window. And you're never going to hear a perspective beyond that. Even people who are outside of the traditional left and right, people who are maybe more, like in the Alex Jones camp, they're now just gathered with the right. So they can keep that dichotomy going. And, if you have somebody like Antifa, that is certainly not part of the Democratic Party, the people on Fox News are going to say, well, this is what Democrats are today. So everything has to fit into those two categories for the mainstream media's presentation.
Yeah, I also think of like Coke versus Pepsi. We want the illusion of choice. We want the feeling like we have freedom, but we don't really want choice. We don't really want freedom. We want to have our choices narrowed down to one of two, and then we get to choose between those two. I think of like the food companies. There's like 7 companies that own all of the other brands. All of the other brands are like umbrella to these 5 or 6 or 7 companies that pretty much own everything that's on the grocery store shelves. Same thing with media. There's like 3 companies that own all, like Disney owns almost all of the media out there. I think it's like Disney and Warner Brothers, which is now owned by AT&T. So it's 2 or 3 companies that provide this illusion of choice, this illusion that we have freedom to consume different media. But the truth of the matter is again, in marketing, they've done experiments where they've offered people 20 different choices and then said, hey, out of these 20, which one do you want to buy? And people don't buy any of them because they're overwhelmed with too much choice. But if you narrow it down to, here, sample these 3 products and tell us which one you like the best. When you narrow it down to 2 or 3 products, people will make a choice and they'll feel like they still had freedom and they feel like they made a choice. We narrow it down: Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. And the reason that we do that is because that's what keeps people engaged. It prevents people from feeling overwhelmed, and it still allows them to feel like they have a choice. So they're given the illusion of freedom.
Yeah, it's something that I hope would die off as like, I hate to have to think about like the elders going away, but this is a form of media. This is a setup that makes them comfortable. Like outside of mainstream media, there's all different kinds of shades of opinion, and you have people of different sides exchanging ideas and having really interesting conversations. And I think a lot of people who've been conditioned over the last 20 years, and that can be people our age, that can even be people younger than us, find that that shading or that diversity of opinion to actually be somewhat overwhelming. I have a boomer dad and he is getting more suspicious about what's going on in the world. But when I try to like open doorways for him to walk through, he just can't do it because he doesn't have like a frame of reference to think beyond this frame that the corporate, primarily in his case, Fox News, has created for him over the last 2 decades. It's tragic that is also affecting people who are 50 years younger than my father is, but it is. But there is hope. I think there is hope, and there is a lot of diversity outside of that. You're shaking your head.
I'm going to push back. I think it's just part of evolution, man. In order for the tribe, in order for society to thrive, you have to have 1 or 2 people at the top saying, these are the choices. We're narrowing it down to, do we go east or do we go west? Here's why we should go east. Here's why we should go west. And everybody else, their role is to say, let's go east or let's go west, because without that inherently in the programming of most people, I don't think we'd even be here right now. I think that the reason that we've survived, the reason that we evolved, is because that is a key part of how society works, how groups function. There's going to be one or two free-thinking people. The ones that are charismatic are going to become leaders. The free thinkers who are not charismatic are going to become outliers. And the overwhelming majority of people just want to have their choices narrowed down to one or two, three options at the most. And I don't think that's something that's ever going to go away. I think that's just the way human beings are. I think that's just the way group dynamics work. I know I just rained on your parade, but as a marketer, I just don't see it as having any other alternative, to be honest.
As I'm processing what you're saying, I'm thinking to myself, wouldn't it be funny if we called this the 10 rules of hate and then we only did one of them because we got hung up on this one for an hour? There is more I could say about that. I get what you're saying. I agree. It doesn't mean, like, I still do hold out some hope, but it doesn't mean that I don't, perfectly see the reality of what you're saying. And, this is a very, very complicated problem that people would need to really be committed to learning their way out of. And I see the opposite of that commitment in the world right now. So we'll move on to number 2. There is plenty of fertile ground to maybe revisit that idea in a future episode. Number 2 is the 2 ideas from number 1 are in permanent conflict, left versus right. CNN, Crossfire on CNN, which was at least what looked like a political debate show that ran throughout, I think, most of the 90s and maybe up until about 2004 when Jon Stewart went on there and totally blew it up. A really interesting thing to go back and watch, like over 15 years later, that interaction that he has with Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala, who are the Crossfire host for that episode. But Crossfire was this like mock political debate show that, in Taibbi's words, solidified the idea that politics is a fight and Democrats and Republicans must not only not come to an agreement about things, but debate to the end in a sports-like forum. Now, what is the end that Taibbi writes about? It's not to a resolution or a conclusion. It's just till the end of the television program, right? That's where we could think about the end as like, okay, people evaluate each other's positions and maybe integrate them into some new understanding. That can never happen. That can never happen. It's just until the end of the program. And then the next night they do it again, following pretty much exactly the same formula where you have, maybe like a vanilla, kind of soft liberal, or this is how it was 15 years ago. And they would usually choose like more combative conservative types like young Tucker Carlson was. And they'd go at it for half hour or whatever it was. Then they'd end and just repeat basically the same program the next night.
Well, in this part of the chapter, he compares politics to professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. And again, I have to go back to placing some of the blame on the viewer. We like conflict. We like drama. If we tuned into professional wrestling match like WrestleMania 32 and the 2 headliners go out and instead of wrestling, they say, you know what? You're really not that bad of a guy. And I actually agree with you about this. And I think the superplex is way overrated. And why are we even fighting? This is ridiculous. Let's go have a beer instead. Nobody would watch that. That would not get ratings at all. And so again, you got to give the audience what they're begging for. And so Crossfire was one of those things where they were like, hey, the audience loves conflict. The audience doesn't want resolution. That's a boring, anticlimactic end to what the audience is tuning in for. And so again, they're giving the audience what they want. And the audience is the one begging for all of this conflict. That's market responses, man. As a media producer, we give the audience what they want, and that's not always vegetables. Sometimes it's candy and ice cream.
Exactly. All right, so we'll go on to number 3. Hate people, not institutions. Oh, goodness. This I think, is one of the most important, if not the most important one. So he writes, Trump is not just the perfect media product. He's a brilliant propaganda mechanism. Though most of our problems are systemic, Most of our public debates are referendums on personality. Not many people can be neutral on the subject of Trump, so we wave him at you all day long. Now, this was written in 2019. We're in 2022 now, and very little has changed. Trump's name is still in the headlines every single day on the networks and in the newspapers where people have been trained to hate him. So I think that shifting away from actually understanding mechanisms of, corporations or governments or the deep-rooted corruption, like, people don't want to deal with that. It's like that quote, the simplest and stupidest conversations, again, paraphrase, are about people. More sophisticated conversations are about events, and really meaningful conversations are about ideas. So the media's job, in their subservience to, the state corporate nexus that runs a lot of these networks, or certainly has great influence on a lot of these networks, is to keep people away from ideas, keep them on events if need be. But even when events happen, shift them to personalities, right? Like if there's, they're reauthorizing the NDAA and Trump has to sign it. And this is an example that he gives in the book. I think it was the National Defense Authorization Act. And whatever the bill is named after John McCain. So here is, the Congress and the executive branch of government signing this huge spending authorization. And the headline they run with is Trump signs NDAA, snubs John McCain, the bill's sponsor, like won't say his name in, when he makes his statement about signing it. So it's shifting away from forget the idea of what is even going on here, how much money is being allocated to what. Make it about the event, but then quickly pivot from the event to the person. Taibbi also says, meanwhile, a vast universe of systemic issues are ignored. We've been steadily narrowing that field of view for decades, particularly in investigative reporting, which barely exists anymore, in my opinion.
Yeah. Also, just two things that I'd like to add to this. As human beings, when we're sitting around the water cooler at work, we're gossiping about people. It's what we like to talk about. Just back to your quote, average minds or mediocre minds talk about people. It is what it is. The news knows most people are interested in stories about people. So they feed them stories about people rather than stories about complex things. We don't want to ponder the complexities of these giant organizations. The other thing too that he points out in this is it's a lot less risky to go after an individual. If you get a slander charge or a libel charge or something like that, the individual is going to have to take you to court. It's the media. It's hard to fight the media on something like that. They're going to have lawyers. They're going to waste a lot of money. Probably not going to happen. It's a safe target for the media to go after an individual. However, if you go after Pfizer or Lockheed Martin, they got teams of lawyers, and you don't want to go after them because there's a good chance that they're going to sue you into oblivion, and they're going to end up eating all of your money. So going after people, it's what people connect with. We want to connect with stories about other people, and it's a much easier, much less risky target than going after these big institutions.
Yeah, and so we saw between so-called left and right over the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen a really mutually beneficial relationship where Trump strategically picked his targets, right, to build support by making enemies. Like, here are the people that I hate. I know you hate them too. Let's hold hands and kind of hate them together. The Clintons, Trump made so many enemies, and his enemy making was all strategic. But for the other side, Trump was the greatest gift ever, I think, in the efforts to mobilize in a certain direction. Trump was the embodiment of everything that if you are a good left-wing person, you are justified in hating and stopping by, at this point, almost literally any means necessary, right? Censorship, political prisoners, freezing bank accounts. We'll see where it goes, but that's where we're at right now. Like, this is the personification of everything that you are righteous in hating and wanting to destroy. So anything is brought back to this personality as we wrap up number 3 here, that this is about hating people, not institutions, and certainly not, expanding that to ideas. Like, make it about Trump, the most hateable man. And that's the great thing about Donald Trump, is like what most politicians look like on the inside, Donald Trump looks like on the outside, right? So he is just so easy for people to hate. And that is he has been like the most bankable media product since 9/11. So,
all right, number 4.
Sure. Number 4 is related to number 3, so we can probably move through it pretty quickly. Everything is someone else's fault. And Taibbi lays out this formula for how they create political news content. He says, number 1, a bad thing happens, and then they ask the question, can it be blamed on one or the other party? If yes, we do the story. If no, we don't do the story.
I see this every time there's like a mass shooting. I see my left-wing friends go, see those crazy conservatives holding on to their guns and we have another shooting. And then I see my conservative friends say, see those crazy liberals taking away our ability to defend ourselves. And now we have another shooting. And before the bodies are even cold, both sides are standing on the graves trying to score political points on their opposition. And both sides totally guilty of this. And myself, I've done this as well. So I can't say that I'm innocent of it. But yeah, number 4 is pivotal to keeping this division going.
Exactly. And one of Taibbi's frustrations as an investigative journalist was he would bring a lot of stories to, media outlets about what was happening in the financial sector, 2006, 2007, all the way up to 2008. And they'd be like, well, can we blame it on Bush? And he's like, oh, not really. It's like everyone's kind of involved in this. And they'd be like, oh, well, we're not interested. If it doesn't have that angle, if we can't like pin it on Trump, like, there's some Fed policy being enacted and it's like Trump's Fed will ruin world or, dramatically alter the future in this country, Trump's Federal Reserve policy. So it's not about the policy. It's about, you can pin it on Trump and then we'll go with it, or we can pin it on Republicans or Democrats and then we'll go with it. If the answer is no, we go on to number 5. Nothing is everyone's fault. He writes, if both parties have equal or near equal hand in causing a social problem, we typically don't cover it. So the same is true, like I just said, with a financial problem, a political problem, any larger scale societal problem. If everybody's to blame, then it's just that would mean like striking the root of an idea to actually go after it, right? If you can't pin it, because then you just get into this like whataboutism of, well, they do it too, everybody's guilty, and that doesn't work. That's not clear lines of good and evil. Go ahead.
I think that one of the things that he misses in this particular point is if it can't keep people at each other's throats, it's not newsworthy. It doesn't run. If it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. I think a lot of times the way the media picks, there's tons of stuff going on every single day. One of the things that I think both sides do is they say, hey, will this cause division? Will this cause people to start fighting with each other on Facebook? The slap was staged. No, the slap wasn't staged. Will this make people fight? If the answer is yes, let's run it. If the answer is no, there's no point in running it. And the reason why I think this is, I remember a long time ago having a talk with my dad when he was still alive. He'd just gotten out of prison and we're living in LA at the time, and we're talking about the gangs and how gangs exist inside of the prisons as well. And I was like, Dad, how come we expect the police to stop the problem of gangs on the streets when they can't even stop the problem of gangs inside the prisons? And my dad was like, they don't want to stop the problem of gangs inside the prisons. As long as the prisoners are fighting with each other, as long as the Aryans are fighting with Laime, and as long as Laime is fighting with the Muslims, and as long as the Muslims are fighting with whoever, as long as they're all fighting each other, they don't unite and overthrow the prison. And I think that that's a large part of this. If everybody is to blame, let's not run it, because we can't use it to keep everybody at each other's throat. If we can keep the prisoners fighting with each other, it's a worthy story. If it doesn't accomplish that, if it makes all the prisoners realize, hey, we're all in this boat together, don't let that story run.
Absolutely. And there's examples of this outside of prison as well, obviously, that come to mind here. Like one of the great escalations in this hate incorporated idea that Taibbi talks about was in 2014, where you had the stories of Michael Brown in, where was that, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York City. So you have two black men killed by police. And, the Eric Garner story, he's basically choked out on a sidewalk by a cop for selling Lucy cigarettes. And then you have the Michael Brown story that is far more complex. So with Garner, even people like Bill O'Reilly and Charles Krauthammer are on the O'Reilly factor going, yeah, the cops were wrong. And at that point, instead of saying, all right, well, let's go to ideas and see what we can explore about broken windows policing and police corruption and, why this keeps happening, like why the police are able to act without accountability, like let's get together and solve that problem. The focus of that year was Michael Brown, because that story was far more nebulous. There was far more room for conflict and division, and it was made into a race issue instead of a citizens versus police issue, because citizens versus police, there's going to be much more, you still have a verses in there, but you're going to have much more unity on the part of the news consumer, I think. And by making it a race issue, you immediately, you just lobotomize people whenever you turn something into a race issue. And that makes the rest of your book of tricks much easier if you're the media. So that was the direction that they went. And, I don't think we've seen a lot of improvements leading up to, 2014 to 2020, when the George Floyd incident happened. Not much changed in policing, right? Because of the way, I think a lot of culpability lies with how the media decided to treat that issue 6 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was kind of like the turning point, or one of those forks in the road where we're at now was hugely influenced by the way that they covered the Michael Brown situation. Then we had hands up, don't shoot, and all of these divisive things that came out of that.
Yeah. And I Can't Breathe is the only chant that we got out of the Eric Garner situation. Other than that, his name by most people who are, carrying the social justice mantle today is probably forgotten, unfortunately. Number 6, and we've already covered this one a little bit, root, don't think. Taibbi writes, by the early 2000s, TV stations had learned to cover politics exactly as they covered sports, a proven, profitable format. The presidential election was especially reconfigured into a sports coverage saga. He also adds in this section, by 2016, viewers had no conception of politics as an activity that might or should involve compromise. And then he rounds that out by saying, we are training rooters instead of readers. Since our own politicians are typically very disappointing, we particularly root for the other side to lose.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that I have to add to that he put in, and I didn't even notice until I read it, is the adoption of sports style graphics in political coverage, and the sports tickers and the screen swipes and all of the stuff that's been a staple, a cornerstone of sports coverage since the late 90s. As soon as all of these graphics and flashy ways of spicing up the sports events started becoming mainstream, definitely during the Trump era, we started seeing all of those graphics, all of those visual cues start making their way into political coverage as well. The things that have been a staple of the sports talk shows started becoming a staple of the political talk shows as well. And I didn't even realize that was something that had happened until reading this article or this chapter. I was like, oh wow, I didn't even notice that. Went right over my head, and I'm usually quick to pick up on these things. So big shout out to Matt for bringing that to the attention of people like me who usually stay on top of this stuff.
Yeah, I also think he has, like me, some connection to Boston. I don't know what it is. So Boston is a real sports town, and it's known for its rivalries. The Red Sox versus the Yankees, the Celtics versus the Lakers, the Bruins versus the Canadiens, the Patriots versus the entire world. Everyone hates the Patriots. So, you grow up in this sports media environment where it's all about rivalry and this conflict. And I don't remember, it was probably when I started getting more interested in like politics and political philosophy, where I looked at this and I was like, what the hell are people doing? Like in sports, you would only have to have like 5 seconds of consciousness to like look at how immersed you are in, like I'm a part of this and these are our rivals and we hate the Yankees, to go, this is a kind of a waste of time, right? But sports isn't loaded with any of the emotional issues that like politics or like exploring what's going on in society or economics or education. Like all of that is absent from sports. And it's still like people are still so sucked into the drama of sports rivalry and conflict and, being on the side of the home team. I don't know if it's in this chapter or somewhere else in the book, but Taibbi talks about these, I think they were radio guys from Boston that would be invited on other stations in other cities. And their job in these interviews was to be like, we love the Red Sox and it's hard to park, and do that whole routine of like, we're from Boston and we only care about the Red Sox and all other teams are the worst. And they're just like, it's really not that important. We don't care. We're just guys doing talk radio. And everybody hated them because that's not what you're supposed to be, a kind of puppet in conflict generation, even when conflict doesn't matter, And I'm surrounded by a lot of people who really love the Patriots and the Red Sox. And if I'm back in New Hampshire, I'll watch the games. When the game's over, I go, what do we win? When everybody's celebrating, we don't win anything. We lost 3 hours of our time. If we went to the game, we lost $300 of our money. So I get the appeal of sports and the appreciation like of the game of baseball, but the amount of drama and energy and anger that people pump into it is just completely irrational. So when people, I think the understanding that a lot of the corporate press had is like, geez, if people will do that for sports, they'll certainly do it for politics, and they have.
And again, it goes back to giving people what they want. My best sales pieces are the ones that take people on emotional roller coasters. The best championship games are the ones that take people on emotional roller coasters. The best political debates are the ones that take people on emotional roller coasters. And if you're in charge of presenting the sales message, the sports event, or the political debate, your job is to take what they present, take what they give you, and turn it into an emotional roller coaster, because that's how you keep people glued to the seats and tuning in.
Yeah. So that takes us to number 7. And this is a kind of betrayal that I think a lot of people feel when somebody who they see, as being on their side, a Taibbi himself, Glenn Greenwald, take a position that creates discomfort in somebody who thought they had an ally in this person. And when these betrayals happen, it's almost like that person needs to be run off into the woods. I mean, it's definitely happened with Glenn Greenwald. As Taibbi says, no switching teams. Number 7, no switching teams. The concept of balance, he writes, which used to be considered a virtue, has been twisted all the way around to mean a taboo trade practice, a form of dishonesty. So I'm trying to think of like I mean, when you get actually into politics, and I think about like Ron Paul debating with other Republican candidates in 2008 and being just like totally off script by trying to present a more thoughtful or more balanced take on what was going on as far with foreign policy in the Iraq War. It was just incomprehensible, and he was the worst person for doing so. So in the entertainment format of media, that plays even better.
I look at this not just from like classic politics, but I think of the example of like J.K. Rowling right now, who has pandered and catered to kind of far left ideologues for most of her Harry Potter career. And now that she's taking an unpopular position when it comes to TERFs versus trans rights activism, and most of her community says one thing and her opinion goes against what the majority of the people who she's catered to feels, she's become ruthlessly attacked. They're attacking her more than they attack Tucker Carlson. And it's one of those things where the no switching teams thing, I think that part of it is you'll be attacked. And you'll be attacked more viciously than the people on the other team. If you're not showing solidarity, if you show any kind of I'm not in lockstep with our team, you become a bigger threat and I think the reason why is because you're threatening the solidarity. As long as the enemy is out there, it's really easy to keep the group cohesive. But as soon as the divergent thought comes from somebody inside of the group, that becomes a much bigger threat than the threat that's out there, because now it's something that can actually tear the group apart. And so we can't allow the switching of teams. I think it just goes back to our own insecurity and our ideas. If somebody who's part of our team expresses divergent thinking, now all of a sudden we have to confront that insecurity in ourselves, and we have to confront the fact that there's insecurity in the groupthink, and that can be even more terrifying.
Oh yeah, Kanye. Jeez. Well, this happens to celebrities a lot, where there is like a certain expectation that if you're famous, you'll hold these like focus tested and safe political ideas. And if you stray away from that, you're in big trouble. This happened actually in 2012 to a poor guy named Donald Trump, who, after being pretty well aligned with, he flirted with both sides, but I think he was a New Yorker, he was pro-choice. A lot of people saw him more as, an ally of Democrats. He would go on The View, he would hit on Barbara Walters and Whoopi Goldberg. I forget who the other women were there, but they loved him. He's Donald Trump. Who doesn't love Donald Trump? Then in 2012, he decided that he was going to, generate controversy and maybe like plant the seeds of a future Donald Trump political project by saying, I'd like to see Barack Obama's birth certificate. And that was like, even though he was never like a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, that was a betrayal, somebody from entertainment culture putting out a conspiracy theory like this about a sitting Democratic president. That was it for him. So anyway, in number 7, Taibbi continues, being out of touch with what the other side is thinking is now no longer seen as a fault. It's a requirement because, number 8, the other side is literally Hitler. Taibbi writes, there's nowhere to go from Hitler. It's a rhetorical dead end. Argument is over at that point. If you go there, this is something we touched on earlier, you're now absolving your audiences of all moral restraint, because who wouldn't kill Hitler? Mm-hmm. So we can talk yes, the literally Hitler meme was something that circulated, 4 or 5 years ago, but there's lots of versions of this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think my first encounter with this line of thinking was actually George Bush Jr. After 9/11, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. I was like, whoa. Just because I'm not with you doesn't mean I'm with the terrorists. And then into the Trump era, Antifa and the punch a Nazi thing, you're either anti-Trump, pro-social justice, pro-Antifa, or you're a Nazi. And it's okay for me to punch you. And this division, if you're not with me, you're literally everything that's wrong with the world. And you mentioned this earlier in the episode, and Matt Taibbi talks about this in the article at this point. This has led to, instead of America versus the Soviet Union or America versus China, this has led to America versus America.
Yeah, that George Bush example is so good because when he said that, like, obviously, yeah, that was shortly after 9/11 and emotions were really high, but that was like a really clear line that had been drawn before, like maybe during the Red Scare, but I don't think a lot of people had ever been confronted with such a choice in their lives at that point. Like when he said that you're either with us or you're with the terrorist, it kind of sucked the air out of a lot of rooms, because not only was it like, all right, pick a side and being said by the so-called leader of the free world, it was also like, what are like the global implications of something like this? Like there's only two sides to be on and we're coming for the other side. Like that's all implied and, no threat was made, but it was like a really dramatic moment that I think a lot of people took note of. If a politician said that today, it wouldn't even register. It's just how they all talk today, Mm-hmm. Like that seems like so much less of a shocking statement for any politician. I mean, Trump, forget it. He says something like that every other sentence, Mm-hmm. So it's amazing what's changed. I mean, that was, just over 20 years ago that Bush said that. And now it's just par for the course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's one of those things that us being into our early adult lives, when we saw that kind of shift in rhetoric, versus I think of my daughter who grows up, she's 12 years old now. She's mm-hmm. lived with this type of escalating rhetoric her whole life. She doesn't remember a time when we didn't demonize and Hitlerize anyone who doesn't agree with us. So I don't know where we go from here.
Yeah, and I just want to also point out too, there really is no good old days of of this. I think like politicians have since like Jefferson and Adams, politicians have gone at each other this way and accused each other of really strange things. But the way that it is so in your face and so normalized and so just part of like normal discourse by people who are considered to be respectable or considered, I mean, even though nobody really believes that, but they're positioned as leaders and respectable. And like there's another code of conduct for these kinds of people that they engage in this kind of childish behavior. Yeah, it's upsetting.
The thing that I find most upsetting about it though is where it inevitably leads. And he makes a great point in number 9 about where this leads to.
Yeah. Number 9, in the fight against Hitler, everything is permitted. And he says, meanness and vulgarity build political solidarity, but also audience solidarity. That was my big takeaway from that as far as like its usefulness. But yeah, you're thinking more about like when you have that solidarity, how does that, where does that mob go and what do they do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, absolutely.
I'm thinking about specifically, and I don't want to point the finger at one side and versus the other, but it's easier for me to see the escalation of extremism from the left because I grew up on the left and I was very much a left-leaning anarchist most of my life. And watching what happened with the social justice movement where everybody is a Nazi and therefore it's okay to do whatever. We can punch them. We can light their buildings on fire. We can, team up and beat the crap out of them and not feel bad about it. That was a scary escalation for me. And what I really realized was those who see themselves as victims tend to make the best bullies. If I can say, hey, I'm a victim of white supremacy, I'm a victim of the patriarchy, I'm a victim of corporate fascism or whatever, if I can paint myself as a victim, then anything that I do to the people who I perceive as my bullies is justified. And then I can do horrible, horrible things and be like, no, but they were bullies. So it was okay for me to do that to them. And that was one of the scariest things. This was one of the things that drove me away from the left over the last, I'd say 5 years, maybe a little bit more, maybe 8 years, 2014, 2015, watching the escalation of this. The other side is evil, and therefore we're allowed to be evil-er. You know, we're allowed to kill baby Hitler because it's baby Hitler. That escalation, that watching the people, I call them cry bullies, watching the people who perceive themselves as victims turn into bullies, that was a huge thing that just pushed me away from the left. And it didn't push me into the hands of the right, like the meme goes, but it definitely alienated me and made me realize, oh, I've been standing with people who have no actual morals. These people that I thought were the ones who were going to help me fight back against the authoritarian of the right, these people are just as bad. And that was a huge wake up for me in just when it comes down to what Matt said, in the fight against Hitler, everything is permitted. I thought that me and my left-leaning allies, I thought we were above that mentality, but I quickly realized, no, that they were susceptible to it as well.
Yeah, I remember reading Nietzsche talked about this idea like 130 years ago. I think it was in what was called the master-slave morality, where he talked about the moral superiority of the victim, right? Like that idea that bullies obviously seek victims, but victims in a way seek bullies to maintain their high moral status as victims. And if you look at how this plays out in politics today, you have one group whose ideology controls the lower levels of schooling, higher education, Hollywood, the media, the government, in two of the three branches. And there is a quest every day to go out and find the thing that they are still the victim of. So that's why there was so much excitement about this so-called Don't Say Gay law in Florida and a similar law in Texas. And I see people just being outraged about this. And I was like, can't you pause for a minute and just be like, satisfied about controlling everything else? And maybe if you're such a big fan of democracy, as you say, you would just leave like one little place. If people wanted to vote with their feet, they could go somewhere else and, have some kind of, life that your ideology doesn't completely control. But when you understand it in those terms, like these people are always going to seek out those kinds of stories where they can maintain that, little guy victimized, fighting for, it's like we're watching all of these comedians who made names for themselves punching up at power 15, 20 years ago, punching straight down at the average American, and they don't even realize it. They can't even get out of, that frame to see how much has changed. But it takes us to number 10, and number 10 is the big payoff. Feel superior. And it certainly helps support what we talked about in number 9, right? Everything being permitted. When you have moral superiority, like, kids bullied at school, they go back to school with guns. God forbid, that story's happened a lot. But they feel like they have a high ground in that kind of retribution. And obviously there's, mental illness and depression, all kinds of other factors and those kinds of unfortunate events as well. But that feeling of superiority is the payoff in, the worrisome way that we're thinking about, like, what does the mob do once they mobilize? But it also gives people that smaller, that dopamine hit that they need, and why they keep going back to these institutions for the same bullshit over and over again. So Taibbi writes, we're mainly in the business of stroking audiences. We want them coming back. Anger is part of the rhetorical promise, but so are the feelings of righteousness and superiority. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And, one of the reasons why I wanted to deal with these 10 rules is I think that it's really, really helpful considering like the escalation that we've watched in the last few years, where you can like call things into the consciousness of other people by defining them, by putting labels to them. It's much easier to understand what something is when it's labeled. So whenever I see an effort of a person to look at a phenomenon and kind of diagram it and put terms to it, like Taibbi did here, I think that's a really, really useful thing in understanding how the media we consume, if we're watching some of this stuff ironically or critically, or even alternative media that in many cases is using a lot of the same plays in their presentation, these 10 rules of hate. We're more conscious of how it affects us by understanding these 10 rules, but we're also more conscious of how it affects others and how we can outreach to others using very, very clear definitions and explanations of what's actually happening here. So I think he does a great service as we get to numbers 9 and 10, and we really see how this can go off the rails in some very, very ugly ways in a society.
I want to just pull this back to marketing real quick. A lot of times when we make a decision, we look for reasons to justify that decision to ourselves, to say we made the right decision. So I voted for this guy. I'm going to look for reasons to believe that I voted for the right guy. I've taken this side of this political issue. I'm going to look for reasons to reinforce that I made the right decision. A lot of times when we buy something, we need reinforcement after we buy it. You buy a new watch, it comes in the mail, and it comes with a card that tells you about how awesome of a person you are, how people of great status and people of adventure wear this watch, and mountain climbers wear this watch, or spies wear this watch. I'm bringing up these examples because I buy a lot of watches. But after you've made the purchase, as a good marketer, you want to give people reasons to avoid what we call buyer's remorse. We don't want people questioning the purchase. We don't want people saying, did I really make the right decision? We give them a bunch of reasons to say, you made the right decision. And one of the best ways as a marketer to do that is to say, hey, tell 5 people that you know about this great product. And we do it right away as soon as you buy, especially on online marketing. A lot of times, one of the first things that we do is send you an email being like, hey, send this to 5 people. And if you get 5 other people to buy, we'll give you 15% off. And if they can get 5 other people to buy, it reinforces I made the right decision. Refund and chargebacks decline a lot if you can give people an option to win more people over. Say, hey, I bought this car, or I bought this watch, or I bought this pair of shoes. I know 5 people who would love to buy these pairs of shoes. It's not about me making more sales of the shoes. It kind of is, but it's also about me giving you the opportunity to win more people over. If 5 other of your friends go buy the same pair of shoes, now you know you made the right decision. And the same thing when it comes to politics. If you can live in an echo chamber and you go to work the next day and 5 people agree with you because they all watch the same news, or you get together online, or whatever the case may be, and you get that what you believe reinforced by 5 or 6 other people, now you know I made the right decision. The Don't Say Gay bill, or the Chris Rock got slapped by Will Smith, whatever it is, whatever the current thing that we're all arguing about, if I can find 5 other people who agree with me, now I know that I made the right decision. I'm superior. I'm in the right. And giving people that opportunity is a huge way. I see a lot of times, like, we talk about algorithms, but also you're watching the news, join their newsletter, join their Facebook group. All of that is opportunities to have the decision that you made reinforced over and over and over again so that you can feel superior. And I just thought it was interesting because in marketing, that's one of the best things to avoid refunds and chargebacks, is give people, after the purchase, a reason to feel like they made the right decision. And usually the best way to do it is to reinforce you're a good person. This is the other type of people who buy this. Get 3 of your friends to buy this as well, and you can feel superior and you can feel like you made the right decision.
Yeah, I think outside of marketing, it's tribalism, right? Like that's a huge part of what this is, even though that's a feature of marketing as well. I think Seth Godin wrote a book called Tribe, maybe like 15 years ago, where he talked about this kind of tribe building for the very purpose that you're describing. But, people have to make meaning very, very quickly in the world today. They have to snap to judgments and conclusions about things. And then they need it reinforced by feeling like a whole bunch of other people came to the same decision. It's also that thinking fast and slow idea, just to take it, a step further, where people are hit by the media or by politicians like Trump in their id, right, in their emotions. And then they have to do this dance of rationality to explain why they've made this decision rationally that was completely actually made by their emotions. It's kind of why like really smart and sophisticated people, like the ones in academia, make the best useful idiots, is they're very, very good at doing the rationalizations, right? They snap to conclusions and decisions emotionally, just like everybody else does, right? Just like, the professional wrestling fan Trump supporter does. But they're much better at, building some kind of high-minded sounding justification. So, yeah, there's lots of ways that people play that game with themselves and with others. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Those are the 10 rules of hate. Avoid them.
I just want to point out, we were talking about how feeding people drama and hate and anger is a great way to suck people in. We decided to name this episode, Why Does Everybody Hate Each Other? So we're guilty of appealing to those same natural instincts that we know our audience has as well.
Guilty. What a great conversation, though.
Yeah, absolutely, Brett. I thoroughly enjoyed this. And if you're listening to this and you enjoyed this, you can find more over at mindsetandmastery.com. We also have some free trainings over there for you as well. And we should be on your favorite podcast app by now and on YouTube, I think over at your channel, correct, Brett?
Yep. School Sucks Podcast is the name of the YouTube channel.
All right, man. Until next time, we will catch you later.
Catch you later.